Well, what a pleasure it is to welcome Mark Powley, Canon Dr. Mark Powley, this morning, who is principal of St Hild College, to talk to us this morning here at Harrogate School of Theology and Mission. As I hinted at a moment ago, we've been angling to get him for quite a while, so we're delighted that this has all come together. Just to give you a little bit of background, after reading theology at Nottingham University, Mark spent some time in secondary education and youth work before undertaking further graduate and ordination studies in Oxford at Wycliffe Hall. After a variety of parish roles, including being Associate Rector at St George's, Leeds, Mark was responsible for the launch of St Barnabas Theological Centre in Sheffield in 2013, and in 2015 was appointed Principal of the Yorkshire Ministry course. Since January 2017, he's been Principal of St Hild College, formed by the merger of these two. In 2020, Mark finally completed his PhD with King's College London on the presence of God in corporate worship. And I understand your Viva was chaired by Rowan Williams. Yeah, you weren't intimidated at all. Mark lives in North Leeds with his wife Elsa and their 4 children, and one of them has their birthday today. So happy birthday, Nathan, and thank you for lending us your dad. How wonderful to have you with us here, Mark, and we're so looking forward to your lecture. Or I should say, this is a very good book that Mark has written, Consumer Deed. Yes, just I had this as an Advent book a couple of years ago, and it's a really good corrective to this time of season. Thank you, Mark.
Well, welcome, folks, and thank you so much for having me. It's a real delight and a privilege to be with you and to be connecting with those who are online. Just where's the camera for Zoom? I should is that camera there? Hello, Zoom, and all who live in it. It's great to have that reading from Psalm 42, wasn't it? Because I remember when I used to go to the place of worship, when I used to go with the throng to worship. And one of the things the time we're in right now, isn't it, is we're returning to physical gathered worship, and we're remembering what it was like to do that. And we're asking ourselves the question, how do we connect with God? So I do hope this topic of in search of the presence of God is relevant and helpful. So as Linda said, I moved to Leeds with my family 12 years ago now, and it's been my privilege to be principal of St Hild College, which has been wonderful to have Linda on the team and a fantastic team of people there. And it's great to see some of our students and alumni as well, which is really great to see you. And we at St Hild offer BA, MA, digital teaching in theology, and we have a centre for church planting, which we're developing and wanting to help support church planting across the region. As Linda said, I spent, it took me about 11 years to finish a PhD. I began on one topic and shifted to another topic, but I think it's probably still fair to say that I spent nearly 10 years looking at this topic of the presence of God. And I would love this morning to dig into just a little of that with you, and also to discuss with you and see what sense we can make of it. Let me say at the outset that the presence of God has been both a gift and a puzzle for me. A gift and a puzzle. It's a gift because I count myself blessed to experience the presence of God, and I hope that that's in your experience as well. But it's also been a puzzle for me. I've found myself having various encounters or having moments in my life when I sense the presence of God, but then I catch myself reflecting, but is it God? Is it real? And that, I guess, is the question I just want to look at with you this morning. What is the presence of God? How do we know if it really is, if it's real? And I want to give an illustration of this. Last week I was involved in an act of worship where we got this song out of the. Now hopefully you can see the words. We got this song out of the locker. Be still for the presence of the Lord. And I wondered if in the spirit of recreation, you might help me just gently sing this verse. You may want to have a mask, but I think we're just playing it either way. So I just wondered, and then I'll tell you a story. But why don't we just sing this verse? But I'm happy to start for us, okay? And there is no band, it's just us. If we had time, I'd do all three verses. But we were singing this just last week. I've not sung it for years, actually. And as we were singing it, there was this lovely, simple guitarist. And then in the second verse, the guitar dropped away and the voices began to carry it. And I felt a shiver down my spine. And just that sense, what was it? It was a sense of attention. I felt attentive to the moment. And as reflecting on it later, time felt different. Suddenly, I wasn't watching the time so much. I wasn't so aware of the time. And we'd been talking in this conference about the future of the church, but my sense of any burdensomeness just kind of fell away. And I guess I would say I felt an experience of the presence of God in that moment. And I was chatting to somebody in the group, and they were just across the way from me, a lovely guy called Stanley, who's in the Anglo-Catholic tradition of the Church of England. And I said, wasn't it beautiful when we sang, "Be still for the presence of the Lord"? He said, no, I don't like that one. But he said, when we were in the cathedral at lunchtime, having Eucharist, I felt a great sense of peace. So that's my puzzle. How is it that I was standing here and felt that sense that God was present and we're singing about God's presence, and Stanley was standing here and didn't? And at lunchtime, it was probably the opposite. So that's why I say the presence of God is both a gift and a puzzle. And so one of the things I did for my PhD, actually, I'll just introduce this quote first. So one of the things I did for my research is I spoke with certain people about their experience of God's presence. And in particular, I found that I was having a conversation, actually, before I even thought of studying it, with people who were scientists or had a background in science. And I spoke with two people in particular who were brain scientists. And what I found was that they were in churches that were talking about the presence of God, but they themselves, as brain scientists, were saying, do you know what? I'm not sure this is real. So that I thought gave me a great research question. And I chatted to them. And this is what Dee, one of these people that I spoke to, said. He said, music may be stirring, corporate activity can still be affecting, an effect similar to that from therapy may occur. All these things may happen, but, he said, I expect these things from church, even in the absence of the existence of God, let alone his presence. I thought, that's my question. And it's a real question that's emerging in real experience. This is a book that was published just months before I finished my PhD. I was like, oh my goodness, you would publish it now, wouldn't you? So I was like, right, I've got to read the book, But she'd already published in this area. Tanya Lerman is an American anthropologist who accompanies churches in the charismatic tradition and then writes about what she sees. And she said, the kinds of events people deem spiritual are, now this is her key word, kindled. Kindled, they come into flame. The body learns to experience these events, and the experience changes the events so that they become more fluent and habituated over time. The man who has heard the Spirit speaking is more likely to feel its breath, shudder at its power, be moved to tears by its love. So as an anthropologist, she's saying that there are reasons why certain people respond in some ways and certain people respond in other ways. She's not writing from a faith perspective, but this is a really significant intervention in discussion. Another example is the God helmet. The God helmet. If you want to know what the God helmet looks like, this is what it looks like. This was a series of experiments that involved placing a helmet on participants' heads and stimulating certain areas of the brain. And what they found is when they did that 80% of the subjects in the experiment reported, according to the experiment write-up, a feeling of presence of some kind. But most of them did not call it God. However, thus far, writes one of those running the experiment, a guy called Corin, thus far, about 20 or so people have reported feeling the presence of Christ or even seeing him in the chamber, that is the room where the experiment takes place. One male, about 35 years old, allegedly atheist but early childhood Roman Catholic, saw a clear apparition of Christ staring him in the face. So this is the same question, but from a kind of neurological point of view. Is it the case that our experience of the presence of God can be kindled through anthropological means or can be stimulated through a neurological helmet? Is it all coming from the brain? And so that's why I say that presence for me is both a gift and a puzzle, because that was my question. Is it real? Does that make sense as a question? Okay, well, in that case, I want to ask you a question, because you've got by too lightly thus far. All I did was make you sing. So my question to you is just a couple of things, just to take a moment and maybe chat to I'm doing this like I would teach at St. Hild, okay? So I'm not very good at giving lectures, but I love to teach. What experiences of God's presence have you had? In fact, I was talking to somebody just before we started about a really fascinating example. So maybe just a moment to share, and how would you describe it? Have you ever had an experience of God's presence? You don't have to have had one, I'm just asking. Do you have a question about the presence of God? And then we might just very briefly take a few, we won't be able to capture everybody's, but it might be nice to hear a couple of examples. Does that make sense? What experiences of God's presence have you had? Just maybe pick one if you can think of one. And do you have any questions about presence? So if we just take a couple of minutes to share with one or two people where you are, and on Zoom, if that's what we do, and then we'll hear back from people in a few minutes.
If you all unmute, then we could have a discussion. I thought I'd try to make this screen smaller, but I'm not allowed to. Right. Or if anybody can put questions that you want me to pass on in the chat room, or anything you want to say to Malcolm at this point. Experiences of God. I'll put the questions up again.
question is, how do you know it's God?
Ask that question. One question might be, how do you know it's God?
When you have a spirit.
I think we must have missed a bit. I've sent a message through.
So, hold on, here it comes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So my piano teacher wrote Be Still, Dave Evans. And when he led us in worship, absolutely the presence of God. It was very simple to step in. Yes, so that was very beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you. Great example. And a few other examples. One here.
So quickly, I've got to say it ever so quickly, one sentence. Okay, 40 years ago, dream, desperate, inside, tent, which is the first temple ever, Moses, and 3 men, no faces, and telling me it's their house. This is your house. And I said, what's the catch? How much is the mortgage? What do you owe? Everything that's external, because I didn't know what was happening. But I have come now to over 40 years of that dream where the 3 men and kept telling me,
yes,
and a passageway, and there was a Sacred Heart with thorns. And I did say to them, are you sure this is my house? You are giving it to me, but I don't like that Sacred Heart with the thorns in the passageway.
Thank you. Thank you. This is important. A song, a dream. We can have a couple others. I think Jemima over there. And then, yeah. It's always good, I think, for the person with the mic if we just do absolute opposite corners. Let's keep this up.
It. I mean, I would say I encounter God in nature. I feel his presence, yes, you know, just when I stop and look, or you know, whether it's the detail of a leaf or waves on a beach or a sunset, and I just feel his presence really close to me.
I think if that's how you feel God's presence, you should work as an environmental officer for the diocese.
Thank you, Mark.
It's just a thought.
I feel called.
Wonderful, thank you. I think we've got one more over here, and then we've got some from Zoom as well, Linda.
Where am I going?
So just one more here in the room, and then a couple of comments from Zoom.
Thank you. Thanks. I can't really do this in one sentence, but I'll keep it brief. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I had an experience years ago when I phoned AA for the first time, and I haven't had a drink since then. Now, I didn't have a sense that someone else that God had invaded me, but I did have a bizarre sense that I wasn't doing the work of finding the phone number and making the call. Somehow that was done for me.
That is so interesting. And I want to come back to that language of invading and God working through. That's really, really helpful. A lot of this is super helpful. Linda, comments from?
The Zoom room are asking more questions than giving answers.
Oh, good. Because, well, let's take a few of those questions.
They say, how do you know it's God? And they say, to what extent does our personality shape or influence how we experience God's presence? Although they do seem to be saying something about an experience of God in prayer. And it says here, is he speaking again?
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. And thank you. So, and I think we won't do any more of the questions. Keep those questions in mind, because we let's see what we can cover, and then let's see how many of those we can meaningfully come back to. But yeah, so really helpful. And let's hold those experiences of presence in mind and a few of those questions. What I'd like to do really with you is these three questions. Number one, I want to look at what is presence. What I realized was, in asking my question, I hadn't even really thought about what presence even was. So I'd like us to begin there. I'd like us to look at some of the biblical material. How does it feature in the Bible? And then how can we understand this today? And touching on a few of the themes we've already had mentioned, which is going to be really helpful. So first of all, what is presence? This is the big question, I think. What I found was that I was in a tradition where I had sung about presence. I had prayed for presence. I could talk about presence broadly, but I wasn't really sure what I was speaking about. I didn't really think about what is presence. So, so that's the question I want to begin with you. Let me tell you, just give you a couple of examples and see what you think, okay? This is Rachel and Rose. They are 5,000 miles apart. This is a Zoom call from Leeds to Los Angeles, okay? Rose, who's in Los Angeles, has written Rachel a letter, a lovely letter, and Rachel decides to give her a video call, okay? That's situation one, okay? Here's situation two. This is Peter and Paul. Peter is inside a TV shop looking at TVs to buy, and Paul is walking outside the building. They've never met. And Paul has his headphones on, but they're only 5 meters apart, okay? Does that make sense? Okay, simple question. Who is the most present? Okay. Okay, who thinks that the most present is Rachel and Rose? Show of hands. Okay, who thinks the most present is Peter and Paul? Show of hands. Okay. Why? Well, so I think we've got quite a strong majority, and some people will be, you know, it's interesting. We're quite used to saying that the Zoom experience is not presence. We've spent about 2 years saying, I mean, it's fascinating how you describe it. I don't know how we describe it now, because we sometimes say, well, we're not meeting on Zoom, we're meeting, if we're not on Zoom, what are we? We are in person. So what does that mean? Who's doing the Zoom call then? Robots? What's the other way? We're not meeting on Zoom, we're meeting face to face. And on Zoom, how does Zoom work? Face to face. So if you notice, if you're at or have been at St. Hill College, I talk about physically gathered, okay? Because I've seen this coming, you see. So why, just in the room here, why is there more presence between Rachel and Rose? For those who said that there was.
They're interacting with each other.
I'll repeat these, they're interacting. So there's exchange between them, that's really helpful. Yes, why else? There's relationship. Yeah, why else? Why is there more presence? Awareness. So one and then there. Awareness. There's awareness of each other, and they are looking at each other's faces. Yes? Right, so there's communication. So presence, it seemed to me, is not the same as proximity. And if you're interested in theological terms, what I found, I've not kind of gone down this route on the slides here, but we talk about the immanence of God. God is immanent. Or we talk about the omnipresence of God. And that was one of the things Rowan Williams pressed me on in the Viva, the omnipresence. Not that immanence or omnipresence is a word in the Bible, actually, just out of interest. We'll come to that in a minute. But I'm not talking, presence is not proximity. And yet I thought actually, I was treating it as if it was. That was one of the things that the journey that I went on. I was treating presence as proximity, as a form of being physically near. But you can be 5 meters apart from somebody. And there is a sense there, but I was thinking there are some ways in which, of course, Peter and Paul are more present. Because if Peter was stuck in a fire, Paul would be able to help in a way that Rosie and Rachel can't help each other. So, my main point is that there's a distinction between being physically present as an object and an interchange. So it seemed to me that there were what presence was exchange through signs. And that's the big thing I'd love to just reflect with you on, and you might want to ponder. It seems to me that, as we've said, there were images being exchanged. One person is visually present to the other, and the visibility becomes a sign which they give to the other, and the other person receives that information, receives that sign, and they also give back images. And in the exchange of those images, that makes presence possible. But there's also words, communication, we said, going between them. And in the exchange of those words, presence becomes, I say possible, it becomes richer, it becomes deeper, it becomes more real. But there were also gestures, and that's one of the things where, of course, Zoom begins to fall short, is you don't get that same physical giving and receiving of signs. So even as we gathered here physically, as opposed to those of you who are on Zoom, some of us were able to share physical gestures. And of course, you can share physical gestures on Zoom as in their visual form, but you can't shake someone's hand. So it seemed to me that presence is a form of, we might think of it as exchange through signs. And that really is the big thing I want us to reflect on. In doing that, just a little theological note, I'm thinking that God's presence has some similarities to human presence. So I'm making an analogy between human presence and divine presence, and theologians debate how much you can really do that. But the route I took was to draw on that, because of course, otherwise, one of the big problems is if you say, well, actually, God relates to us so impossibly differently than we relate to each other, well, then why use the word presence? We only use that word to describe what's going on right now, however it's going on, both digitally and in the room. So it seems to me there was something we needed to follow through about presence. Let me make one other observation. It struck me in preparing these slides, actually. I picked the illustrations deliberately because Peter in the shop is looking at a screen, and so are Rachel and Rose. Presence isn't an extra thing which enters the situation, even though we sometimes talk about it like that. We say, presence arrives, there's a sense of presence, but there's no extra thing. So with Rachel and Rose, the fact they're present to each other doesn't bring another thing into the room. It just means that the elements of creation which are already there begin to enable presence to happen. So presence isn't an extra thing in the room. It's something that happens to the things in the room. The things in the room begin to transmit presence. They begin to enable presence. And the interesting thing about Peter and Paul is there are also things in the room, but those things in the room effectively block presence. They become, if you like, opaque. The wall cannot be seen through. The headphones can't be, heard. You can't hear apart from the headphones. So presence was not about how many things there are in the room. It was about whether the elements of creation actually are transmitting presence and allowing presence to be shared, or whether they're actually kind of shutting it down and blocking it. Does that make a kind of sense? That's what I'd like to dig into just a little bit more So this is the chap that I studied, a guy called Hans Urs von Balthasar, a great Swiss theologian of the 20th century. And he said this about signs, and make of this what you will. Man, he uses that term for generic humanity, does not see God directly, but through the medium. So this is about mediation, about traveling through things, the medium of his own intentional acts. Revelation is therefore not a new form within the created world. It's not a new thing in the room, but a new manner of God's presence within the form of the world. This is this notion that we were just looking at in our example. Another quote from Balthasar about significance, by which he means signs. Significance requires an appearing, and don't worry if some of this doesn't make sense, significance requires an appearing surface. There's got to be something that you see or engage with, upon which a non-appearing depth expresses and indicates its presence. So the sign is what you see, but the sign isn't everything. There's someone who's creating that sign. The surface, so to say, is loaded with the whole sense contained in this depth, yet it does not come apart at the seams. So you and I, when we're giving presence, I see you and you see me, or I hear from you and you hear from me, and in that, presence occurs. But what we're sharing is actually signs of presence, words, images. The image is not actually me, but it's a sign of me. The words are not actually me, but it's a sign of me. Does that make sense? We're sharing something which is a sign, and behind that sign, if you like, lies the person of who you really are, which you can't communicate, but you can communicate with words, with gestures, with images. That's something of what is going on when we are present to one another. And just one other thought about that. I think one of the most interesting things that struck me about presence as I dug into it is that means that presence is indicated by lots of things. So it's not one thing, it's lots of little things coming together. And then when I was researching, you realize that the word presence in Hebrew is not like it is in Latin. In Latin, the word presence is prayer essay, being before. It's a very abstract word. My presence with you is my being before you. Being as in essay, my essence before you. It's very abstract. In Hebrew, my presence with you is face, panim. And your presence to me is face. So when it says in Psalm 139, where can I go from your presence? It doesn't say, where can I go from your being before me? What it says is, where can I go from your face? Where can I flee from your breath? Do you think we might have lost something in our translation, in our kind of Latin style translation? And when we're talking about presence, how easy it might be for us to think of presence as a kind of ethereal, conceptual, abstract thing. Or if we really wanted to as a kind of chemical, powerful thing, and not this personal, featureful, intricate, physical, bodily thing. So that really amazed me about face. But the thing that even amazed me all the more was panim in its Hebrew root is actually plural. So it's what we have a kind of version of that because we talk about features. If you say somebody's features, you technically kind of mean their face in the right context. So features is our plural way of referring to face. Well, panim in the Hebrew is like that. So again, I was thinking of presence of God as a single kind of thing. But what actually, even the Hebrew terminology, it invites us to think of presence as a set of features. And so I ask you, how many features does a face have? How many features does a face have? Lots, right? I mean, it's almost infinite. The human face is the most complex. You know, it's the thing that you recognize first. It's the thing that a child recognizes first. It is the thing that your brain is programmed to process more intricately than any other visible reality you ever see in your life. A face is the most expressive, most complex thing. And I was thinking of the presence of God like a gas that either is or isn't in the room. And I thought, what if it is like a face with all these different features? And each feature is a sign. And what we do when we read a face is we put the signs together. We see the eyes, and we see the eyebrows, we see the shape of the forehead, we see whether the eyes are glistening, whether they're half open. We put all those signs together, and with all those signs, we read a face. Well, then it seemed to me that that's what we're doing with presence. With presence, with face, which is actually the same thing, we're putting all these signs together, and from the signs, we have a sense of a presence. And so that's why I say that we might think of presence as an exchange through signs. And that might lead us in some slightly different directions than we might have gone previously. So my summary at this point, just to kind of check in with you for a moment before I've got one other sort of set of things I want to share with you, is that presence is not therefore a new thing in the world that can be measured in kind of parts per million, which is almost the way it almost felt to me as a teenager growing up in the church. I felt like people say, oh, there's a sense of presence in the room. I thought, oh, I wonder if it's like, 30 parts per million. It's just gone up to like 60 parts per million. Presence is not a new thing in the room. It is a mutual exchange through signs. And that means that it is infinitely rich, because you've got all the signs from one person to the other, and all the signs in response, and all the possible configurations of signs on both sides. So it's infinitely rich. And a little bit of that is, and if you think of where on earth, we'll look at the scriptures in a moment, but one of the great ways you'd root that is in 1 Corinthians, where Paul, he starts to think about what if each Christian is in their gifts brings a part, a meros, a part, but there is one holos, the whole, a soma, the body. So Paul begins to think that each Christian's gift might bring a part, but then there's a whole which emerges from the parts, which is much greater. But then he specifically in chapter 13 relates this to presence and says, now we see in part, but then we will see face to face. So presence, it seems to me, is an exchange through signs, where it is a mutual encounter, which is infinitely rich, in which the various signs are only parts, but together something emerges, which is a face or presence. Well, I just want to take a little. Yes. So I said I want to just look a bit with you at the scriptures, and then take a little pause before some final thoughts. So, how does presence feature in the Bible? And this might help us kind of flesh out this idea of signs. So we've talked about signs which are physical signs, signs which are visual signs, signs which are verbal signs. And I'm sorry that the print is very thin on the slide, so I hope people can bear with this. Think about the Old Testament story. There are physical signs from God of God's presence. So sometimes in the very early stories, you have like a physical visitation. And we were talking about in the dream with three visitors, but Abraham has these three visitors turn up physically, as it were. And Jacob wrestles with God. So you have physical signs of God's presence. The land itself is a physical sign of God's presence, and the temple with it in time. You have visual signs of presence, classically the cloud and the fire. And of course, you have verbal signs of God's presence, the giving of the law, the giving of prophecy. So the whole Old Testament story gives us these various ways in which there are signs from God of presence, of attention, of communication. But also from Israel, there were also signs in response. So sacrifice is a way of saying, I'm going to physically bring you something which is part of my worship, part of my coming before your face. And indeed, in the Psalms, it says, come before him. What does come before him mean? It means that you need to be present to God. Does that make sense? You need to bring your presence into God's presence. You need to come before him. So there's signs from God to Israel, but there are signs back. And in that, you might speak words of the Psalms to God. So there are words from God to Israel, words from Israel to God. Visual and physical signs from God to Israel, and visual and physical signs in response. But the prophets say, well, justice is also a sign of your presence before God. If you want to be present to God, you've got to attend to justice. And so actually, it struck me that what was important here was that there were lots of signs from God to Israel. And there were lots of signs from Israel to God. It depends on the context, depends on the time. But it was never just one sign. In the sense of, love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul and strength. So that an implication of this is, if you think that there's only one sign of presence, and if you pursue only one sign of presence, you're not doing it right. It's got to be to love the Lord your God with your heart and mind and soul and strength. And if you say, this is the sign, this is the temple, folks, it's the temple. The temple is a genuine, bona fide sign of the presence of God. But if you say, this is it, this is the temple, we've got it, and as long as we worship in the temple, we're just fine. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And the prophets will come and say, hold on, what about the way you're treating people? What about your hearts? So the moment we say that the presence of God can be reduced to a single sign, we run the risk of idolatry. And as somebody pointed out to me at St. Hild, actually, even the word presence is a sign. And you could even take the word presence and turn that into an idol. So in the Old Testament, if that makes sense, signs from God to his people, signs from Israel in response. And when those signs meet, you get presence. You get a sense of presence in very different ways. The New Testament, if we're going to do our theology properly, the signs from God to us all coincide in the life of the human being, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the sign from God to us. He is the physical, the verbal, and the visual sign from God. But the amazing thing about Jesus is that the signs from us to God are also in Jesus Christ. So Jesus is presence. He is the meeting of the signs from God to us and the signs from us to God. And in Jesus, you see both. And so he is the word, or sign, if you like, made flesh. And that's where you get, something like at Jesus' baptism. At Jesus' baptism, there are signs from God. The Spirit descending, you are my son. That's a sign from God to Jesus. But at the same time, that he is there in his obedience, offering himself as a sign in his humanity to God. So in Jesus, you get the perfect meeting of signs from God to humanity and signs from humanity back to God. And so Jesus is, in that sense, presence. But as the rest of the New Testament unfolds, we could do a much fuller analysis than we have time for here. You know, we could talk about the signs of healing given from God, the signs of being filled, the physical bodily experience of being filled with wisdom, filled with the Spirit, visions and dreams, bread and wine, we could talk about as signs from God. God's love in us, which we'll come back to. There's prophecy and scripture. So all these signs from God to us. And in the church, just as, as we looked at with the Old Testament, we also need to give signs back to God, to present our bodies as living sacrifices. And a sacrifice was that physical offering. So presence occurs where the signs from God to us meet the signs that we give in response. And there's an interchange, an exchange of signs, a communication between us. And of course, that's why I say it's infinitely rich, because there are so many ways in which those signs might be given and those signs might be returned, as it were. Just a couple more thoughts on this scriptural background, and then we need to take a breather before some final comments. So just a couple of larger theological thoughts. John, I just think is amazing, John's gospel. And John, he wants to tell the gospel differently to Mark and Matthew and Luke on the basis of Mark. And so he tells his whole gospel, he frames his whole gospel with presence. And he begins it by saying, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Presence. So if we're really going to think about presence, let's not think about something which kind of just occurs in the world. What we need to think about is something that begins in God. Theologically, we might say God is self-present, that presence is part of the eternal life of the Trinity before the world is made, because the Word is with God. So what happens really is that the process of creation, all things come into being through him, and incarnation, that is what we would say is an unfolding, a sharing of the presence which is in God, which is God from before the beginning of time. And that the whole purpose of creation really is that God, who is self-present, eternally present as Father, Son, and Spirit, might share that presence, might invite us into that presence, might unfold that presence in new ways through created space and created time. So whenever we're experiencing presence, we're really tasting something which is eternal and full in God always. And God is allowing us into the presence which always is part of God's life. So that's one kind of a deep perspective on it. And so we might tell the story of presence in the scriptures. Thus, we might say, so I throw these words as I tried to get my head around it. We might talk about the presence that is already there. I call that the preceding and exceeding presence. This is the presence of God in the Trinity. This is there before it all begins, and it always is. And then in creation, we have what I would call a life-giving and upholding presence. It's a different kind of presence. And as we experience right now, we are all experiencing the life-giving and upholding presence of God. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here, and neither would I. So we're now experiencing that presence, which is a taste of the presence of the Trinity. It's one way of experiencing it as a life-giving and upholding presence. But in this experience of Israel, we see more than that. We see not just a life-giving presence, but an accompanying presence, a judging and a saving presence. And we see that unfold through the Old Testament. But in Jesus, we see more than that. We see an indwelling and a transforming presence. And through faith in Christ, we come to know that for ourselves, which is really a way of entering into the life of the Trinity, which is always there, not just as created or accompanied, but as indwelt by God. And in the future, we look to a limitless and perfecting presence. And so the whole of our experience of God can be told through this story of presence, of signs given and received, which are really ways of sharing in the life of the Trinity. I won't. So a little summary at this point, and I want to make some final comments with you before a kind of question and answer session. But before I do that, let me just summarize. So I'm saying that presence is a mutual thing. It is not a simple substance that just exists, blumph, in a room. It is a mutual process between people, epitomized as face-to-face. Presence is multiple, infinitely rich, through signs given and signs received. And presence is an unfolding. The Trinity is truly revealed in its overflow into the world, in creation and in the incarnation of Christ, says Balthazar. So that might be some of the ways that we think of presence biblically. Now, I want to just give you just a moment to pause, because I think we've just covered lots of things. And then before I make some final comments, I just give you this moment to chat. So just want to take a couple of minutes. What do you think of this idea of knowing God through signs? What do you think? And you might want to say any more about the signs of God in your own life. Can you recognize signs of God that kind of come together to make a picture? So should we just take a couple of minutes just to make some comments? What do you think? And then we'll just do a final thing together before the last Q&A. So 2 or 3 minutes now, just to think, what do you think of this idea? I just want to say some kind of final words of prepared material, and then we'll take a break, a proper break, like a real break, and then we can have some Q&A. So I'm not going to take questions now. I will take questions and comments after our break. But I just wanted you to kind of debrief, really. So that's what I've been, encouraging us, inviting you to think about presence as an exchange through signs, as a face which has so many different aspects, and that our experience of that presence is an unfolding of the life of the Trinity, where we grow deeper and deeper into the life of God through creation, through the scriptures, and principally through Jesus, as we give and receive signs in ever deeper ways with God. Does that make a kind of broad sense about where I'm trying to point us? And I'm very happy, I just want to give you a couple more things to try and land this from my point of view, and then we'll take a break, and then you can ask whatever questions you like before we finish. Mm-hmm. So I want to just address, well, how do we understand this today then? I want to draw out 3 implications to kind of stimulate your thinking and to kind of offer you some thoughts. My first implication, and what I think arose for me in this area of understanding presence, was that God doesn't give like we give. This was the conversation that particularly came out from talking with the scientists. Is that especially the D who I chatted with at length. I felt that ultimately he was expecting God to give a sign of presence like he would give a sign of presence. And as I've said, there is an analogy, there is a likeness between how humans give signs and how God gives signs, but there's also an unlikeness, and that's really, really important. When we give signs of presence in a body and as a body. So the only way you can be present is in your body, and you can only be present as a human body. And that's how you are present to me and I am present to you, even if those signs are being projected through the medium of technology, they're still you in a body and as a body. But God is not a physical body and doesn't act as a physical body. And that's an important distinction. God gives what can give through all things. That is, through anything. I'm not saying God is always giving through all things in the same way, but God can give through all things, but not as all things. God appears in a cloud, but God is not a cloud. Yeah, you get the idea? God appears through a rainbow, but God is not a rainbow. He gives through all things, but not as all things. And that's a big difference. What it does enable, though, quite beautifully, is that it means that the giving, and this is coming back to the comment earlier, which is just going to be so helpful. It means that actually, when we're giving signs to each other, sometimes we're giving them simultaneously. So you're looking at me and I'm looking at you, and we're giving the visual signs together. But when you're in a conversation, hopefully you don't both talk at the same time, right? It's either one talking and the other listening, or one listening and the other talking, right? When we're giving signs of presence, we give because it's really genuinely us giving, because we choose to give it and because it reflects our personality and our culture, and it's really me, giving you the sign. But that's not how God gives, because God doesn't give in a body. When God gives, why is this a sign of God? Well, not because God gives it through a body. It's a sign of God because God is the source of it. That's why it's from God. That's how you know it's genuinely from God, is because God is the source from which it comes. Which actually means that we can give and God can give at the same time, which we'll come to in my next point. Because when you're giving, you're speaking your words, and you're thinking them in your head, and you're pronouncing them through your mouth. But at the same time, your giving can be God's giving, because God is the source. My main point here is that God doesn't give signs of presence like we give signs of presence, because God isn't a physical, God doesn't inhabit creation currently as a physical body. So when we're talking about science can measure observable phenomena. Like if there is a cloud or a rainbow, science can tell you, well, how big is the cloud, or where is the rainbow? But science can't recognize the presence of a person. Here's the funny thing. So I was debating with scientists and thinking, oh, this is a bit difficult really, because I believe in God and God can't be seen. So is God really there? And I'm thinking, okay, so what is presence? What does it mean to have the presence of a person? And I realized science doesn't have a measurement for the presence of a person. Like not the presence of you or me. There is what is the scientific unit for measuring a person? Science does not have, and cannot have, certainly the physical scientists cannot have a notion of the person. It's just not a scientific idea. And yet, all science is done by people. So what I realized was, in looking at presence, it wasn't that as a Christian, I was constantly on the back foot, trying to kind of squeeze my notion of God into the edges of the debate. What I realized was actually science can't account for the presence of a single person in the world at all, ever. To account for the presence of people, you need the language of personhood. And even our notion of person, actually, as it happens, comes from the Trinity. It comes from the Christian faith. So when I say that God doesn't give signs like we give signs, I mean that actually, if you're trying to look for the signs of God, there are things that science can measure, but what it can't measure is people. And just as it can't measure human people, it can't ultimately measure God's presence. All it can measure is neurons firing, or people moving, or words being spoken. And they might be signs of presence, but they need to be understood as a sign language. And that's where something like Psalm 19 comes in. The heavens are telling the glory of God. They are giving signs of God all the time. But there is no speech, nor are there words. Their voice is not heard, yet their voice goes out through all the earth. There are signs of God in creation all the time. but we need to learn the sign language to understand those signs, to read those signs. Or as it says in John's Gospel, Jesus did many other signs, but these are written so that you may believe. So even when we see the signs, there's still an act where we need to receive them and believe those signs. And that seemed to me to be what was happening in part of the debate between faith and science on the presence of God. A second point, God gives through creation. And this comes back to such the helpful point that our friend gave us here earlier. By which, so I draw your attention, as I was talking about earlier, when we're speaking, it can also be God speaking. Or as it says in 1 Peter, the one who speaks, whoever speaks must speak as speaking the very words of God. So it's you speaking, but it's also God speaking. Or if you're serving with the strength that God provides, supplies, so that it's you serving, but it's God's strength serving in you. So God gives through creation. That's how God gives. Created matter, the things around us, are not the stage curtain. A stage curtain is, to me, you've got to pull it back to reveal the action. And I think sometimes as Christians, we think that's what it is with the created things of the world. It's like what God wants to do is pull back the things of creation so you can see God at work. But that is not the way God works. God does not invade. We talked about that word invade. God does not invade creation. God involves creation. And that is a big difference. So God works and gives his presence through creation. God gives through a bush which is burning, but it still remains a bush. He gives his presence through bread and wine, but it still remains bread and wine. It can still be eaten, it still tastes of bread, etc., etc. And this is the great dignity of creation. The dignity of creation is that God doesn't have to get rid of creation and draw it to one side so he can actually become present. He doesn't need to get rid of you and get rid of me and come into the world as a separate thing and then go from the world. God speaks through creation, gives presence through creation. The bush burns, the bread becomes the body of Christ, and you and I can speak as though speaking the very words of God. And so as we are giving, God is giving, which means we need to acknowledge our role and our responsibility in experience of presence. And recognize that we can host presence. We can actually host presence when we gather together, and we can't do it without each other. We are, in that sense, like bricks in a temple wall. Each one of us a brick. And it matters that those bricks come together. It matters that you turn up and are physically present in the room. It matters that you're there on the Zoom call, giving your presence to others. And that, I think, is what we're learning out of lockdown. And that, I think, is the prayer for the church, is that we learn again how to gather, because the temple needs bricks. If God is going to give his presence through us, then we need to re-engage with church after lockdown. We need to be present again. We need to connect again, because God is going to give his presence through his people. A final point, and then let's take our break, which means, as you can see where I'm going, that we become signs of God. You see, I've been talking about it as if we receive signs of God and then give signs back to God. But actually, what we've been leading to is something deeper and more wonderful, which is that we actually become signs of God. Or we become words of God. We become, dare I say it, features of God's face. Because if God is giving through us, then we become the sign. We become the sign of God's presence. And here we might think of this is an artist's rendition of Mary meeting Elizabeth. Mary experiences God first as an overshadowing. The power of the Almighty will overshadow you, and you will give birth to a son, says the angel who Mary encounters. But the presence of God doesn't stay at that distance for Mary. The presence of God becomes part of her, inside her, so that internally she carries the presence of God. And then Elizabeth meets her and testifies to the joy the baby inside me leapt, because she recognizes that Mary is a carrier of the presence of God. So this story gives us a powerful image of believers carrying God's presence and recognizing others as carrying God's presence as well. Balthasar puts it this way: Jesus experiences God not in an objectivized vision, which is separated from his own reality, but rather in his humility, which opens itself up wholly to the God who sends him forth. We become no more a looker on, but a cooperator of glory. So the aim of presence isn't so that we go, I had an amazing time at church. God was present and I watched. God met me and I was met. The aim is no less than what happened to Mary. I experienced God's presence, and now Christ in you, the hope of glory. Now we are ambassadors to God, for God, as if God were making his appeal through us, so that we might become signs of God, carriers of the presence of God, gathering together to receive God's presence through one another and to give God's presence to one another, so that God's presence emerges in our midst, so that where 2 or 3 are gathered, truly he is with us, because in part we gather. And so God is always with us. But this deep union with God goes beyond our sense of whether we feel God is present or we feel God is absent, because it's a deeper union than that. It's a carrying of God's presence in us and with us. And may God give us the sensitivity to cultivate this sense of presence in us and to be those who observe the presence of God in and through other people. A final word from Balthasar: we see within the most seemingly unimportant interpersonal relation, we see in that the making present and sacrament of the eternal I-thou relation. In the presence of others, through Christ, we see the life of the Trinity. We share the presence of God. We carry the presence of God. Amen.
Amen.